Father, Son, Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Our Father,
who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.
Our Lady of the Rosary,
Pray for us.
in this month of October. Today, I would like to finish up with this document, The Church in the Modern World, which, as you can see, is gigantic, and focus on the last two parts of the third section. Remember, the third section is urgent questions or problems. We're going to look at two of those, and then I'm going to flip over to section 2, which we haven't looked at. And if you recall my comments, the document was written the introduction, part 3, and then part 2. And so we'll look at that briefly, and then I'd like to pull together some kind of summary comments about the council, and maybe we can even think of possibilities of doing other things. There's many documents of the council that we haven't even skirted and looking at. One of the privileged moments we have 50 years, last Friday or Saturday was the beginning of the council 50 years ago. And 50 years later, a number of things have been published. This was first published in French. Congar, who was this very important theologian during the council, kept, which was typical of him, he kept a journal, a day-to-day journal, and was published in France and in French, and now it's been published in English. And a lot of these journals now are becoming public, and I'm going to pass around just to get an idea. Now, this one here, I read it, and then my brother Wesley read it, and with his credit, he's stuck in there with it. Because sometimes journals are tedious, but we get kind of a you were there feeling. Cardinal Series, who, if you remember, represents a different perspective. His journal is published, but it's only in Italian, and it would be wonderful if his was translated into other modern languages, because it gives us kind of you were there from the other perspective there. So as we begin, just to remind you, I'm not going to package this out a lot because I've mentioned this over and over again. There's these two tendencies within the council. Over time, the pastoral dynamic tendency about the church is being identified as the majority. And the institutional juridical understanding of the church as the minority. And we've seen a number of these votes where you have like 2,300 to 50 and things of the sort. So you can see that development. But just to be aware of this, because today we're going to see some interesting dynamics. Are they really fixed ideological camps is one of the questions I want to leave you with in our time together, as the modern media would have had us believe at that time, because there's some things that are going to happen. Now we're going to move to chapter 4 of the third section of Gaudium et Spes, and it's going to address the question of the political community. And there are 4 sections there. Again, always starting with reality, what is first. What is modern political life like? And the council says, and we're going to be looking at the one that says, it says page 1 of 3, so that didn't have a header on it. And it basically says there's all kinds of dynamics in the political life today. We have repressive regimes, we have all different kinds of realities there. Governments are helping their people and oppressing their people. And then they go into number 74, which you have, and there, if you will, it's a kind of it's a philosophical and theological, and it's summing up for us kind of a synthesis of the church tradition regarding the political community. And it acknowledges that there are various forms of government, and there's a positive view about the political order. But what do we do to make a judgment if it's a good system or a bad system? And that's the core of Catholic thought from the time of the 4th century, is that the institution of government promotes the common good, the welfare of all of its members. That's the ultimate criterion to judge, is this a good system or not? And as we know in historical theology, when Constantine not only legitimizes Christianity in terms of it's legal to be a Christian, but also, if you will, canonizes it and makes it the official religion of the Roman Empire, then we have a richer Catholic reflection on Christian reflection on the role of the government. And his famous treatise and his huge work, The City of God, he says, first of all, the church is the sun and the state is the moon. The church role is to illumine the state in terms of its values and role. And he has these officii, or offices, the three offices of the state, to provide for its members, and in particular for those who are weak and cannot provide for themselves. So there's, if you will, the social welfare of all, but in particular those who cannot care for themselves. To defend the nation is another role, to defend the people against threats, exterior and interior, and to order society, to make sure that we're not all running through the red lights at the same time. That in Rome was not effective. They didn't get that straightened yet. But the third, and that's a controversial point in our time, is the state has a role of instructing people in morality. And today, that's disputed in many parts of the world, that the state would even codify morality. And so from that kind of beginning reflection and going through the whole history, you have tons of people who are political theologians. For the purpose of the council, where they draw most of their language is from the 16th century, where, if you remember, in the 16th century, the Europeans discovered there's another part of the world, the colonial period from Europe. And theologians are going to reflect a great deal about human rights, international law, things of the sort. So all that richness is going to come in there. So they're saying that the common good is the core of that, and yet it says the people in the second part who come together in the political community are many and diverse. They have every right to prefer divergent solutions. And in our own society, just by way of example, way back when a lot of us were younger, there was a movement in our country to pass an amendment called the Equal Rights Amendment, which dealt with rights of women. Now, for a Catholic Christian to hold that there is an essential inequality between a man and a woman would be against the teachings of the church. But every Catholic didn't think that was a good idea to pass an amendment. And that's where you said we can have divergent solutions to solve our societal problems. And so even within Catholicism, even on very, very volatile issues like legalized abortion, for a Catholic to hold for abortion would be a moral problem. But that we may like to address this problem in our society in divergent ways is permissible and even desirable, because maybe one of us will come up with a solution. If we just have one approach, we might miss an opportunity. So we recognize that there's a unity in truth, but a plurality in options as we move forward. And it's clear, therefore, that the political community and public authority are founded on human nature, hence belong to the order designed by God. Now, this is very abstract, but basically when we start talking about the order or the nature of things, this gets us into 13th century theology. And the position held that the angels, which we believe in, when they were created, God gave them infused knowledge. They knew everything that we need to know to be perfected. And they were given a choice to choose God or not with full knowledge. And we know some of them didn't and become the demons. And they had one strike, you're out. But humans, and again, this is, if you ever want to see something infallible about the Father Creator, is Creator loves diversity. I have my vegetable garden, my flower garden, and even on the same plant, you can't get the same flower perfectly. God loves diversity. And so when the Trinitarian love decides to create humanity, they try a different approach. And they say they will come to the knowledge of God through acquired knowledge. That we're born in ignorance, and then through our parents and society, we will learn what it means to be human. So we have acquired, and it's in that philosophical understanding of the human person, philosophical anthropology, that the state has a positive role, because it too is part of helping us to come to acquire knowledge of society. So they're speaking this way. And so any kind of form of the state that's going to promote the common good, to respect the rights of the people, can be good. So if the church is not going to lock itself into one thing. But it also recognizes, but where citizens are oppressed by public authority and overstepping their competence, they have a right to protest against these things. And it's actually required of citizens because of the common good, that we have a right to stand up. Now this is a little softer than we'll see in later documents of the church post-council, because there's a long tradition in Catholic thought, social thought, of the right of the masses to tyrannicize, to kill the tyrant. And that's not the pastor. And how this develops over time is when there's long-standing oppression and all the other options are exhausted, the people have a right to rise up and even kill the tyrant. Okay, during the council, Cardinal Ottaviani speaks strongly for this right of the masses to rise up against the tyrant. But in fact, it's softened down. Later, in Paul VI's encyclical Progress of People, he explicitly recognizes it, and the most blatant recognition is the document issued by Cardinal Ratzinger called Freedom and Liberation in the early 1980s. He says clearly the poor have a right to rise up and kill the tyrant. So this section here is kind of dancing around our idea.
Say that again.
Which document?
He truly killed the tyrant?
Yeah, kill the tyrant. There's no other option. You can kill the tyrant. And it's called tyrannicide. Yeah. And it's a long-held part of Catholic social thought. We don't promote it a lot in our parishes. And what I have to tell you, as a theologian who has specialized in this area of the Church's thought, I was shocked in '83 when that was issued by the Congregation of the Faith, that it came out so strong, because the whole purpose of these documents was to tone down liberation theology. And it's in this context they talk about true liberation theology, and there's tyrannicide sitting right there. Needless to say, there were many discussions in the corridors about that. Where are we going? Okay?
Bring it out into the home.
So now, everything's sweet, isn't it? Well, now, this is the lightning rod of this text, number 75. Really, from the time of the Middle Ages, 11th century on, the institutional church had supported a model of government which was hierarchical and monarchical. And so feudal princes, kings, emperors, any kind, it was a hierarchical, and it also reflected in the institutional arrangement of the church. So there had been a long support and, if you will, a cozy relationship between monarchies and the church. And the church had received protection from these institutions as well. With the French Revolution, which is hard to appreciate today, but could clearly be seen as a traumatic event in Christian Europe for Protestants and for Catholics, because this was prevailing in Germany, and the Lutheran world and the Anglican world, the state and the church were embracing each other. So the French Revolution puts a bolt in this whole thing. And post that, Gregory the 16th, Pius the 9th, and Pius the 10th had explicitly condemned the notion of democracy, condemned it as a heresy of our time. In the syllabus of errors, it's very clear that democracy is a problem. So we have these highly authoritative statements of the papacy, not looking at this issue in a benign light. And yet, more and more in Western Europe, democratic countries are existing, and the church is actually thriving. But the little baby of all who is confronting this kind of notion is the United States of America, because the church here had thrived under a democratic system where the church and the state were not cozy. So this sets off this huge debate. And in the draft, the word democracy is used. Our friend here, Cardinal Ottaviani, and his supportive group, they mount an attack on the document. They do not want democracy mentioned, and he gives, in his perfect Latin as always, he reminds them of previous authoritative statements on this matter and counsels caution. You're flipping what three recent popes have said about this. And then, who later becomes Cardinal Garon, he's the Bishop of Toulouse. He says, we have to admit the church has made some big mistakes in this area, and we just have to move on. But the big movement comes from what they call the American moment. Now look at this. This is the cover during the week when this is taking place. Guess who's on the front page of Life magazine? Cardinal Ottaviani. Look who's on the front page of Time magazine, Cardinal Selman. Okay? So again, don't underrate the role of media in understanding Vatican II. So they go to it, and there's all kinds of things going on. And you say, well, this is a no-brainer. This is going to be a fast vote. But let us step back. Salazar has thrown democracy out in Spain and is giving protection to the church in Portugal. Franco has conquered the liberal socialist movement through a bloody civil war in Spain, and Franco and the church are hand in glove. And by this time, Latin America, the Catholic world is dominated by dictatorships. And they don't see democracy as this free honey. And so you can imagine how this thing goes. And so the document, again, where they have the three ways of voting, and when the document comes up to vote, there's a large block of placet juxta motu. Okay, remember, they all have to write the thing. The commission has to take the document back for drafting again, and ultimately, they do not use the word democracy, but they talk about all citizens, therefore, should be mindful of their right and also their duty to use their free vote to further the common good. So how do you exercise your free vote? What kind of political system do you have to have? Democracy. So, as so many things in the council, they find a middle way to move forward, but not to alienate one perspective from another. But this is a very interesting discussion, because it really shows you how the historical, cultural situation influences the way we theologize. We don't theologize in a vacuum. We always theologize in a historical moment. And that's what's happening here. And I might add, remember, that there's another piece to this argument, and that's Eastern Europe. Hungary, Poland, and all these, who are being held by the jaws of totalitarian communism. So guess the alliance, the Eastern Europeans line up with this crowd here, the American movement, and they're pushing the other way. So what I'm trying to point out to you as we look toward the end of the council, the alliances are not pure, that people shift for a number of reasons, different positions. So Eastern Europe longs for the day when they can have a democratic free society. The Americans and the French and the Northern European countries, West Germany and England and Ireland, they've been enjoying Canada, they've been enjoying these freedoms. And so they're saying our experience has been positive, and then you have this other issue. But within this, Cardinal Ottavani is reminding them of previous authoritative statements. And so when you read 75, what you're really reading about it is democracy. And so all the way through this, in this this text, they're talking about the right and the duty to participate, how the council is going to develop, and so forth, but they never come out and say that the preferred model of society is a democratic free society. They're saying it depends on, you could have a monarchy, and if it promotes the common good, it's morally legitimate. Another factor that comes in, remember we have Africa, Asia, and the bishops bring up that some parts of the world, there's not, the society is not at an educational level that a free democratic society would function, because it implies some literacy. And again, if you've had opportunities to go abroad twice, I volunteered to be an international observer at elections. And one of them in Latin America, in Bolivia, the people, the literacy is so uneven that each party has a color piece of paper. And when you put your color in the box, and then the other colors you put in the shredder, and so that they know that you're not going to load up the box. But that's the only way you can get the masses to participate.
We have the same thing. We have a little muck donkey and a little. I never go that way. So.
Exactly.
You don't want to put your foot in that, do you?
Well, we could kind of express it more forcefully, jackasses. Another version of politics after what we've just seen, this horrible situation in our family. But so they, all of this is coming into the mix. So you say, why didn't they just come out and say this is a great thing? Because the church is living in diverse situations, and there's all kinds of factors that come into this. And remember, colonialism is still a reality. It's still a reality. There are a lot of countries. Nigeria gets independence in '69. So it's when you're getting into this thing. So at this point, with the lightning going on and the commission saying it will withdraw the text and rework it, then Cardinal Ottaviani, with his aide, and this cardinal who we haven't met yet, Cardi, he gets up and he says, this whole idea of talking about the political order is not opportune. Why don't we not talk about it? And they said, well, no, we're going to talk about it. And then Paul VI intervenes and says, yes, the council will move forward and discuss this. The typical dynamic we have there. So the Americans, it was the American moment. And Time magazine documents it fully. And okay, it's a day of glory. And again, another point that comes up in here, which will ultimately, in paragraph 76, have to be dealt with, because the church had held that the state not only can protect, but the church must protect the true religion. And so they believed in kind of a theoretical or state religion. And we have Augustine supporting that. And another notion that evolves is that the state should protect the true church because heresy has no rights. Error has no rights. So you had this denominational notion of the church there. And then this more broader view, the church and the state both are seeking the common good within their own particular mission. The church has a duty to preach its social teachings, and demands the freedom to do that in every society. But individuals have to exercise their consciences. So this is the other view, and that's what you're going to find in 76 ultimately. And a very startling statement that says the church does not seek any political privileges for itself, only the right to teach its doctrine in freedom. That's a huge departure from the historical experience of the church, not the doctrinal experience, but the historical experience of the church. The church has always, from the time of Constantine, not only had, but sought protection. And so you will see at the beginning of 76, it is said, it is very important, especially when a pluralistic society prevails, that there be a correct notion of the relationship between the political community and the church, a clear distinction between the tasks which Christians undertake individually or as a group on their own responsibility as citizens, guided by the dictates of a Christian conscience, and the activities which, in union with their pastors, they carry out in the name of the church. The church, by reason of her own role and competence, is not identified with any political community, nor bound to any political system. Okay, so this is, again, showing this development. The church and the political community in their own fields are autonomous and independent of each other, yet both, under different titles, are devoted to the personal and social vocation of the same people. So this is ultimately how these issues are resolved. Now today, again, 50 years later, we're not there. So again, like I said, some of this looks kind of archaic when we look at it. But what the council does is resolve its intolerance of any kind of democratic state, and it resolves this delicate relationship between church and state. And you will see ever since then, every pope denounces any claims for temporal privilege from the state. And where we see it most dramatic when Paul VI takes his tiara off and gives it to the poor, because he says the church claims no temporal kingdom, it's a heavenly kingdom. And he gives his crown away, and we've never had hope for that since. So it's, again, if you recall what I said early on, Catholics are doctrinal, but we're symbolic people as well. We're sacramental people. We use symbols and sacramentals and sacraments to penetrate deeper mysteries of our life. So what the Pope is taking, what is being said in a doctrinal way, a theological way, symbolically to the church, he's illustrating to us that I'm a pastor, and my role is pastoral, and part of that role is to speak out clearly on social matters. The church is going to become more aggressive articulating its doctrine previously, because in many countries with state protection, they had to watch themselves. And that does continue in places like Portugal and Spain for some years. Now we go to chapter 5, and it's devoted to the question of peace. Now this will be peaceful. We're going to talk about peace. Not quite. This is the next lightning rod. But let's just look at the paragraphs as we go along. First, there's the introduction, which talks about the world situation. What is the nature of peace? And it's a basic theological, nobody's going to argue with it. Peace is a product of human endeavor and the salvific action of Christ. We alone cannot establish. Jesus is the Prince of Peace, and ultimately the fullness of peace. So the church is not a utopian philosophical group. They know that this ultimate dream, when all creation groans for Christ, as Paul tells us, is a product of the salvific culmination. So we're not, totally out in space using assistance. Okay? So we're kind of... Then, and again, as I mentioned, one of the great characteristics of the 20th century is how many people we can kill and know about it. Between weaponry and communication, it's been a grand war in the 20th century. And so we have the savagery of war. And then the question of total war, what we would call weapons of mass destruction and things. And I'll come back to that. We have the arms race, total outlawing of war, causes for the discord and remedies, and then the community of nations. And in particular, there's support, not absolutely of the United Nations, but they're saying at this time that's all they got as a forum. And then talking about economic cooperation in world aid. So it's a complex document. But where's the heat going to hit? Okay? I think all of us might have been around or maybe heard about it. We're in the midst of the Cold War. John Kennedy has declared the missile gap. Remember the missile gap? We have to catch up. The Russians were ahead of us. Now, today, historians say that wasn't quite the case. But anyway, those of us who believed it, and we were practicing, nuclear protection, we were crawling under our desks in school and being told to say the rosary when the atomic bomb dropped and all that. We also we have these two camps, the Warsaw Pact and NATO, which are armed with nuclear weapons pointed at each other in Europe. And the focal point of the Cold War is Europe. That's where the line was drawn. The Berlin Wall is established, things of this sort. And we know that there is this arms race going on. So that's kind of the historical context that this is going on. And yet we have a whole theological tradition going on here. So here we go. It goes on further. We have all these different texts, some useful norms, the role of Christians in the international aid, the presence of the church, the role of Christians in international organizations, the role of individuals, dialogue, and a world to be built. So it's a it's going to be a huge, huge document. And that's the one that says 1 of 4 pages, section 1 there. And we're not going to be able to do all of these, obviously, because it's a big one. But I'm going to focus my remarks on these 3 sections because they are what becomes neuralgic. Most of this stuff, people are willing to vote for it and send it in for the final drafting. But these 3 become very, very controversial. And so there's the American reaction, and you're not going to be able to see this too well, but here we have Cardinal Meyer, Cardinal Cushing, Cardinal Spellman, Cardinal Ritter, and Cardinal Mooney. And within that group, ultimately, 70 United States bishops line up against those 3 numbers. We're going to see in the text some things that make one uncomfortable. For example, using civilians as targets can never be justified. The indiscriminate bombing of cities can never be justified. It must be totally condemned. Dresden, London, Atlanta in another war, but we have the Japanese question. Yeah. We are the only country that ever used nuclear weapons. And here we have people going to it. So this is going to become a very strong document, and the Americans lining up with the British hierarchy are going to fight this document. So remember the old alliance is the institutional? The shoe has shifted. And who comes out like the rhino that he is? Cardinal Ottaviani and friends. with his monumental, they say, one of the greatest speeches of the council on October the 7th, 1965. He addresses the council, and he makes this great event, this great speech, again in perfect Latin, but doesn't miss one pronunciation or wrong tense or anything. And why I say this, because everybody marvels at his mastery of Latin. So the commentators immediately said, he rose to the podium and spoke in perfect Latin, okay? And so in this, he says, we cannot deny the reality that we are surrounded. Now, remember, they're in Europe, and the missiles are pointed at each other. We can't go around it. We cannot deny the savagery of war which so many of us in recent memory have experienced. You know, Italy and all these countries. We cannot be silent on these things, and we must be true to the teachings of Christ. And he goes on through a lot of different things. He says, we acknowledge the right of the state to defend its citizens, but excessive retaliation and things like this cannot be allowed. And he goes on in this speech to the pathways of peace. And I've selected this picture on purpose. Cardinal Ottaviani, while being a strict disciplinarian and believed very much in punishing people, as Congar and others who were disciplined by him, he devoted every spare moment to an orphanage in Rome. And any resources he got, he would funnel into that. And when he dies, he leaves his modest estate to the orphanage. And when he wasn't working chasing heretics, he spent his time in the orphanage. And this is a rare photo of him with the orphans there. And he would always spend Christmas with them and the holidays and things of this sort. So he's a very less than the monster that the media would have had. And he pleads for this. And one of the things he wants the council to do was to condemn aggressive and militaristic toys for children. And he never allowed in the orphanage anything like guns and bows and arrows, all the things that the little kid used to play with.
How do you spell his name?
Ottaviani?
Yeah, spell it, please.
Okay, it's on your nose pretty much. Ottaviani. I think this might be a 9 there. And he's the head of the congregation of the Inquisition, Holy Office Inquisition. And he has always been the vocal person protecting the juridical institutional notion of the church. And so he's been the conservative, the reactionary, and here he's coming out as the ultimate liberal flower child of the council. But the American bishops have a good thing, and so when they go to a preliminary vote on the draft, 700 and something looks to vote in it, which is a clout. And some that were sympathetic, like the German bishops, realized we're free in West Germany because of the nuclear threat. And if you recall, when John Kennedy was president, years ago I wrote a major paper for a chapter in a book about it, but he was the one that articulated MAD as the policy, mutual assured destruction. And it was supposed to be, was it 14 or 20 seconds or something? But basically, if the Soviet Union shot these rockets to destroy us, that within a matter of seconds, we would launch ours. Now, we knew that not everybody in the United States, but a strategic destruction would occur. All the industrial and mainly the East Coast was going to get blown off the map. But we also had this policy like we would, the west part of Russia would get blown off the map. So it was what was left could not function. You were destroyed. And so this was called mutual assured destruction. And MAD was the code name for it. So this is being articulated during the Second Vatican Council. So the United States, in this case, is not the champion of freedom, justice, and the American way, and all that kind of stuff, but rather is a problem. So what are they going to do with all of this as they go along? So they're going to, first of all, look at the reality. And if we look at the beginning of paragraph 80, the power and perversity of wars is immensely magnified by the addition of scientific weapons. For acts of war involving these weapons can inflict massive and indiscriminate destruction, thus going far beyond the bounds of legitimate defense. Indeed, it is a kind of instruments which can now be found in the armies of the great nations, were to be employed to the fullest and an almost total, altogether reciprocal slaughter of each side of the other would follow. Not to mention the widespread devastation that would take place in the world and the deadly after effects that would sprawl by the use of these weapons. Now, Kennedy's dead, Johnson's the president, the war in Vietnam is beginning, but it's a direct comment of the Warsaw NATO formal position of defense. And so the council, in a sense, is condemning both of those positions as untenable morally. So here, So here, we're going to get tons of interventions against this. The most eloquent of the United States group is Archbishop Hannon, who was an auxiliary in Washington. At the time when he was appointed Archbishop of Lawrence, he was the most decorated Catholic chaplain in the history of the United States military. So he had a very strong military background. Cardinal Spellman at this time is the head of what we call the military ordinariate. Today it's separated out. The Archdiocese of New York was in charge of the military. And they had to make sure that chaplains, they got their faculties, the priests got through New York. If you were in the military and you wanted to seek an annulment and went through New York, all those kind of things. The baptismal records and all that were kept in the Archdiocese of New York, and he was the head of it. And he was a fierce promoter of what he called the crusade against communism. He used the language of crusade. So he was a real Cold Warrior and a great friend of Pius XII, who was also a Cold Warrior, who despised the communists. So they're all trying to moderate this thing. And Hammond gives this incredible speech and basically saying, if you pull the rug out of the free world, from under the free world, the consequences will fall on this council. The blood of the world, if you will, is going to be on it because the United States is going to save us. Well, ultimately, as you see, they didn't kind of take all this to heart. And it says, so if we come back to the top of page 2, all these considerations compel us to undertake an evaluation of war of an entirely new attitude. The men of our time must realize that they will have to give sober reckoning of their deeds of war, for the course of the future depends greatly on the decisions they make today. With these truths in mind, the most sacred Holy Synod makes its own the condemnation of total war, already pronounced by recent popes, and issues that followed. And again, Paul VI had gone to the United Nations and condemned total war in the General Session. That's what he says, no more war, war never again. Okay. And this is a dogmatic comment. Any act of war aimed indiscriminately at the destruction of entire cities of extensive areas along with their population is a crime against God and man himself. It merits unequivocal, unhesitating condemnation. right in the ink of the desk part of the Raphael. That's his picture. He got what he wanted in there, this condemnation. And so then this will develop further. Now, a lot of you lived during this time. I don't know if you were aware of these debates that were going on, but they were throughout the council widely produced there. And again, in this area, there was the two American moments. So the Americans went to the council kind of as little baby lambs, and now they've become rams in the herd. They're willing to fight for their beliefs. But again, we see the council moving along.
There's a whole lot of discussion going on at that time, I remember, about these very things that were coming out of the council. People in the church were talking like,
Oh, yeah. And these lightning rods were what really was communicated to the masses. The substantive theology that was lost on magazines. Now I'd like to look at part one. Remember, there's introduction. We looked at the prize and the hopes of the people of the world, or the prize and the hopes of the church. And then we have the second part, which we just hopped through, about the urgent questions. But remember, the methodology of the council was always to give the principles first and then the applications. And this document was written in a different way. It started with the reality and worked towards the text. So what we have are 4 sections here. The first is on the dignity of the human person. The numbers there are the paragraphs. The community of humanity, human activity throughout the world, and that's really talking about a theology of work. That is a little bit more elusive. And then the role of the church in the modern world. So there's these paragraphs that go through. I'm not gonna go through tons of this, but I want to show you a pattern, because this section here, especially if you want to deepen your own spirituality as an individual, I recommend highly that you read. You don't have these. But what we see in these 4 sections is what I would call a theological loop. That's my term, okay? I create terms like this. And my students write these down and say, "Oh, is this a theological loop?" And the next thing the professor said, "What are you talking about theological loops?" They always start with the first principle. In this case, the dignity of the human person, the first principle is that we are the image of God. That God came into the world, and He is God made us in their image. They acknowledge, which is always part of our truth, that there's a reality of sin. So we're the image of God, but we're a wounded image. We're not corrupt. We're not Lutherans, but we're wounded, okay? And then here you're going to see the nature of the human person. We're in body and we're in soul. Things of this sort. We have a mind, we have a will. So all of these things are dealing with what we call classic scholastic anthropology, the mind and body and this and that. Then the dignity of the moral conscience. And Vatican II is a council of the church of the conscience. We saw that in ecumenism. We see it in the doctrine of the church. We see it in these sections we look that people have in the political order. Each one of us has to exercise our conscience. And here, not only do they re-articulate that, but they give us a definition. Now, you would say all of us know what a conscience is, but frankly, in historical theology, many saints and holy people have proposed definitions of conscience. And, and you think, well, all the Vatican II, 50 years later, you would have it. But many people still see the reflexive conscience as what the essence of conscience is, or sometimes called the reproaching conscience. Like Jiminy Cricket that said, you did it, you did it, you did it, you did it. And it's very much psychologically associated with guilt. Okay. Well, just very briefly, our conscience, first of all, in terms of location, is where you and I alone are with God. Nobody can enter that space but us. It's where I stand in front of God with my truth. Okay, who I am before God. And in that truth, I see the good I am and the bad. Because the function of conscience, or the place of conscience is with God, the function of conscience is first to enable us to recognize goodness. So it moves us toward the good. And secondarily, by effect, helps us to avoid evil. Okay? And then this reproaching conscience, which we don't see in the council document, is retrospect. We look back and I said, I thought this was good. But in fact, either because of consequence to myself or to others, what I thought was a good is not a good. In fact, it's a bad. Or my conscience wasn't correctly formed. I listened to people who were not seeking my good or the good of society, but I was led astray. So I must withdraw from that and listen. So the last part of conscience is it has a duty to form itself according to the gospel and teachings of the church.
Just a footnote, as a psychologist and all the junk you had to go through to get, I should say,
Well, we all had managed to get 5 degrees.
But, with what you said is absolutely, I'll bet Freud and Jung sat up in their graves this morning, because that's the kind of, from a psychological perspective, the stuff that they were promoting, independent of the church.
But, and this is why the Catholic Church to this day is a little weary of psychology, because what holds all that together? What promises to the good? What helps us to avoid evil? What helps us to step back in the truth before God? Always the love of God, grace. Without grace, our conscience cannot function. We cannot hear the voice of the church. These old fogey men sitting around this basilica, what do they know about life? If grace says, maybe you're overstating your position. You're a little cynical there, buddy. Let's take a little look at this, okay? Then the necessity of freedom. Remember, we cannot love in the context of coercion. The conscience always has to be free to be exercised. We can instruct, and many of you are parents and you know how you would like to protect your kids from things. Often in pastoral ministry, you instruct them to the best of your ability in which we understand to be the good, but you can't live their life for them. But if we didn't have that freedom, there would be no choice, and there would be no possibility of salvation, because it's when we love God. They talk about the mystery of death and the riddle of death, and then they address at quite a length atheism, its causes, and the role the church has. Because in the 1960s, the view of the council was that the growth industry in terms of belief system is atheism. And if you atheism in France is the largest, in quotes, religion. So this gives you a context. But here's the loop. So they start off with the human person as the image of God, go through all of this, and wind up over here. Christ is the full model of humanity. And I just, if you can bear with me, I'd like to read a few excerpts from that section. It's number 22. In reality, it is only in the mystery of the Word made flesh that the mystery of humanity truly becomes clear. For Adam, the first man, was a type of him who was to come, Christ the Lord, Christ the new Adam. In the very revelation of the mystery of the Father and of his love, fully reveals man to himself and brings to light the most high calling. It is no wonder then that all the truths mentioned so far should be bound up in him, their source and their most perfected embodiment. He is the image of the invisible God, is himself the perfect man who has restored the children of Adam that likeness to God which they have been disfigured from ever since the first sin. Human nature, by the very fact that it was assumed, not absorbed in Christ. So Christ assumes full human nature, has been raised in us also to the dignity beyond compare. For by his incarnation, he, the Son of God, has in a certain way united himself with each one of us. He works with human hands. He thought with a human mind. He acted with a human will, and with a human heart he loved. Born of the Virgin Mary, he was truly made one of us, like us in all things but sin. And then they develop further. So when we say, well, what is the council's vision of the human person? We look to Christ for the sources of our response. And so we see this, if you will, we start with the person and we find the fulfillment of the person. And we have these loops. The second session deals with the community of humanity. So we're communitarian by nature. Remember, we are put in the earth and we have to acquire. Now, if we need society, the infant baby, human baby, is absolutely useless to itself. It's totally dependent on society, the family. And so we're communitarian by nature. We're a social beast, if you will. And there's an interdependence of persons and in society. Again, we come back to the common good, which was developed over and over again with God. And this requires the respect for the human person and requires of us respect and love of our enemies, which is, the precept of the gospel. And here the council forges new explicit territory, the essential equality of all peoples. It acknowledges that we are all not of the same intelligence, of the same physical capacity, cultural finesse, all this stuff, but in its essence, we're all equal. And so any notion that says we are not equal, it could be based on gender, race, cultural background, national origin, any notion like that is condemned with great severity. And the council doesn't condemn a lot of things. So any notion that would deny the essential equality of all people is, in the pre-Vatican II church, heresy. Okay? And here they take so you get a little, they blow you a kiss, but now you're going to get a little tap. And it says, but we cannot just fall into this radical individualism. We have to have relationality in our life. And this comes from responsibility and participation in society. And so then we're going to have the loop again. We start over here, and then we come down to the Word made flesh and human society. What does Christ's life tell us about living in society? So you have this connection. Always from the first sections to the last is a summary, that what we would call in theology a doxology. Yeah. Preaching the retreat this weekend, which I was teaming with the sister, and the last conference, she'd do one, I would do one, and vice versa. But the last conference, I did the second part, and a style of closing the retreat is kind of exhort people to go forth and enliven themselves with the Spirit and serve the church. And so at the end, I went into this doxology, and she said, oh my gosh, she said, I thought for a while there you were going to have a tech revival. These are in text, but that's what they're doing. They're kind of pulling it all together within of Christology. Because remember, the first document on the church, the mystery of the church makes no sense without Christ-centered church. So that's what they're doing in this section here. The third section talks about the value and the meaning of human activity, the value of work. It's a very positive, it's an obligation for us to go out and build up the world and realize that our human activity is flawed at times. We don't, what we think we're building peace, we might be building war, things of this sort. And then human activity as the fulfillment of the Paschal mystery, that we are continuing creation and redemption of the world. So we go out into the world to continue the mystery of God. And Vatican II is full of mystery language. And then we get the role of the church. There's a mutual relationship between the church in the world. Remember the very first part of the document, the cries and the sorrows, the hopes of the world, or the cries and the sorrows and the hopes of the church. So again, the mutual, we're in one history. What does the church offer to individuals? What does it offer to society? What does the church offer to human activity through its membership? So we enter, if you will, the secular world, and we are building up the kingdom of God there. And what does the church receive from the modern world? The church does receive from it. It learns new ideas. We come to a deeper understanding of you and these disciplines, these heretical disciplines, psychology. They help us to understand the human person in a different way. We're always looking at these things through the filter of Christ, but we're learning about ourselves. And the church recognizes a certain autonomy. The church, for example, in medicine, does not have a competency to tell a brain surgeon how to open your skull, to remove a tumor, and restore the pieces they used that were healthy back in there, and you're going to get up and walk and talk again. The church, I wouldn't want some cardinal archbishop to guide that.
No way.
But the church will defend its right to intervene into the medical field when the value of the human person may be diminished or used as an object for exploration and intellectual fantasy and things like that. The church will intervene in the conversation and say, at the end of life, when is enough enough? And when can we use certain technologies for the human person and not? So the competency of the church is always on the moral level, not on the technical level. And the same with economics. The church cannot say how to run the stock market. It might be investing in there and it has managers, but it doesn't know how to run the stock market. But it can say when a stock market is run by a few crooks that throw incredible amount of people into poverty and destroy their retirement, there's a moral flaw there. And we've got to look at how this system is working. And not only does the Catholic Church claim that, but in the New York Times, there's an incredible essay by a conservative rabbi saying he was ashamed of the fact that so many of the people involved with this tumbling of the economy were of the Jewish tradition. He says, have you forgotten the widow, the poor, the widow, and the stranger? I mean, he would come out really and gave him a real biblical lashing. So this section is done with this. But then here's the ultimate doxology. Christ, the Alpha and the Omega. And I think some of you are more familiar with me than others. But remember, I'm always doing that circle. That we come from God and we're destined to go back to God. And this is what they're going to talk about in this doxology here. I'll just give you a little snippet. The Lord himself said, behold, I am coming soon, bringing my recompense, to pay everyone for what he has done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the last and the first, the beginning and the end. And within this doxology, they remind us that there is going to be an end of time. There's going to be a judgment of us all. And many of these things that have been done in darkness, there will be a reckoning. But it's Christ who is the beginning and the end here. So in these sections, like I said, I haven't unpackaged them in great detail, and they were not very controversial. There was no lightning bolts here. But finally, all these pieces are voted and all involved in it. But now we have about 2,500 bishops, and all of them vote for it except 42. document. And it's approved and it was given approbation by Paul VI. But it was one of the most struggling documents because you're talking about concrete reality in history. And people live in concrete reality in history, and we have expertise about our concrete reality. So I'd like to make some final comments, and I'd like to get your final comments as well about the council, because I've had my agenda. First of all, the council was conceived by John the 23rd as a new Pentecost for the church. And when we talk about the church in 62, what the church is today, it's not quite the same place anymore in its practices, and its doctrine is the same. But this idea of a new Pentecost, and one of the great desires of the Pope was to awaken all the baptized to take on the mission. And today, when you look in where if you're in the poorest country of the world or in a place like this, how many ministries exist today that we never even had a notion of today? The church did come alive. Remember at Pentecost, what happens to them? They go out and preach Jesus. And today, that has happened throughout the world, and it's incredible. And I think of the parish where I serve, it was a pastor, 5 associates, 2 brothers, and 16 Dominican sisters. And I go back there from time to time, and I can tell you there's more ministry going on today than when we were there, because if we couldn't do it, it wasn't done. It was always deferred. People would say, we really would like to have like a little preschool, Sunday school for the babies, that they can go out like we have today. They go out and have it. And Father would say, well, let me see if I can get one of the sisters or the brothers to do that. And if we all say, well, we got enough to do, we're running a school and the catechism out, well, you can't do that. But the idea after the council, and that was a concrete case, this lady came to me and she said, I have 3 preschoolers, boys, and she said, this would be great if we could do it. The response of the pastor said, well, pull some people together in the parish and make it happen. And they made it happen. That would not have happened 4 years before.
Right.
And so this is what the dream of John the 23rd was. Throughout the council, there's a marked passion for the truth. I mean, it's the press puts it as the Democrats and the Republicans and maybe the Tea Party there. That's their civil or secular interpretation. But all of these people that we see, whether it's an Archbishop Hannon fighting for peace, or as an oxymoron, or Ottaviani holding on to the institutional vision of the church, there was a truth in all these people. They were fighting for it. And there was always an awareness of the need for this unity of the church. And even this group, Cotuous Internationalist Country, when the council was over, these Brazilian and French bishops, save one, stuck with the church. Lefebvre was the only one to form the church in there. Ottaviani in the interview with the journal from Milan, when he was said, throughout the council you opposed it, and now you're the head of the Inquisition. What he says, I will discipline those who don't obey the council. And he wants to excommunicate Lefebvre. And Paul VI says, well, let's give him a chance, maybe he'll come around. Still dealing with that. So there was a sense of passion in the truth, but there was also a sense of unity. It was made up of very human people with limitations. And I passed Congora's journal around, and you will see in there that there were clandestine meetings at the Belgian College where people got together and strategized how to get their view, how to neutralize Peretti and Trump and all these characters. And they were plotting. And we also have Siri's journal, who says how they were getting in Ottavi's office and plotting how to neutralize the other side. So we see Lino constantly giving a new draft, and they think we'll kill it in committee. Very, very human things. And sometimes if you read these journals, very mean things. You see people referring to each other as ignoramuses and jackasses, or a jackass in a red outfit and things like that. Lovely things were said, all in the context of charity. But they were human people in human times, like us too. And they were fighting for what they believed with great passion. Many of them had dedicated their life to incredible sacrifices in academic study to discover the treasures of the church, and they weren't going to easily let go of those things. Their life commitment, the Lumen Gentium for Congar was the culmination of his whole life work, which he begins as a student brother like Brother Samuel. He rarely exceeded common recreation. There was always the minimum of half an hour. He was one that would immediately excuse himself to go to the library. From a young brother on, he was not one of those who liked to burn the midnight oil over a little spirits. He was disciplined, and he was willing to fight for what he believed in. And others who had invested their life in supporting the institutional church and keeping false ideas from creeping in the church were willing to fight for that. Trump and Peretti, as young Jesuit scholastics, were told, you are being trained to go to the Holy Office. And they knew every canonical mechanism to extract heresy out of the people who tenaciously clung to it. And they had this investment. Very, very human. But the miracle is within all that fragility and limitation. In some way, the Holy Spirit kept renewing the church. The fact that they could bring such a unity vote at the end of these documents can only explain something beyond human effort. And I've emphasized this throughout. The media was a major player in understanding the Second Vatican Council. The First Vatican Council was reported. The New York Times periodically would give a little news notes on it. But this was instant and interpreted news. It was never just publishing speeches and things like that. It was always had an interpretation of it. And whether it was the letters of Xavier Ryan, who was a Munde Bloom, of the way he saw things, it was published in New Yorker magazine, or the newspapers, or Time and Look and Life, which gave us visuals to enjoy as well. The media was there, and I have to say, people imprudently sometimes enjoyed the coverage. Bishops and theologians became sort of like rock stars. They liked to give interviews, signing autographs. I mean, it's true. They come out, these people would be there, and all of them did. And all of them they kind of lost it a little bit. And didn't realize that the media is not always our friend. When I worked in Art Curia, the head of our order used to say, the public media has not declared yet that their mission is to promote the mission of the Dominican order. So know who you're talking to. And we went to media school. Someone who knew the world told us how to do it. And they said, before you give an interview, you decide what you want in the press about the Dominican order. And so no matter what happens, that's what you say. And I recall once during Central America, a great deal of drift when I was in the Curia in Central America, and I go to Nicaragua and with the head of our order, and we were given a great welcome. We were brought into the VIP lounge, and the press was all over there. And I'll tell you a little weird thing that happens in there. And they said, well, are you getting a lot of pressure from the Vatican to get the Dominicans not to be involved in the revolutionary process? And he said, we were founded in the 13th century for the salvation of souls. We have 2,000 young people entering our order right now. We have great hope for the future, and I'm sure the Dominicans here share that joy with me. Now, are you planning to remove any of the Dominicans here? The Dominican order was founded. And was a small little notation with a picture and the head of the Dominican order arrives and to promote their mission, blah, blah, blah. He wasn't going to go there, you know? But if you make the mistake of off the record, I was into when the bishops in the United States did this peace pastoral. I was in Geneva for some other work, and I was through somebody said there's somebody would love to get some comments about the American bishops' peace pastoral, and so I was pretty aware of it and involved. I knew Bernardine and some of the players, and especially Brian Hill, who was the main scribe, and so I was interviewed, and afterwards, and I said, it's sort of like talking about just like doing theology in the belly of the beast. I said this off record. The header was doing theology in the belly of the beast. So, and that was part of the council. But I brought up this question of the vote. On all the final votes, there was never exceeded 0.02% that voted against the council of the bishops. So that's, you know, and yet, but remember they went through all these processes, and voting and Modi and correcting text and taking into considerations people's concerns and the like. So in spite of the limitations of working with little index cards and in the magazines of the Vatican Library, when Leonard Boyle was the in charge of it, he used to let us go around and see, they're just boxes and boxes, and these massive boxes of little index cards filed meticulously by some poor nun who went blind, I'm sure. There, of all this stuff that was done to make the council happen. So, was it an event of the Holy Spirit? Had to be. There's no way that this could have been accomplished without it. So we continue to see the council living in our life.